Hello, puppies and kittens. Hi. I often do these interviews or investigations based on something that somebody's charged me to do. And recently, and one of the shows that I was on, or the chat group of some video, somebody challenged me to show conclusive, peer-reviewed studies showing that when we die, we die. Uh, More specifically, he said there is no evidence that consciousness stops when the brain dies, which I kind of think is a bold claim. He or someone else then demanded that I produce one peer-reviewed paper that definitively confirms that consciousness ceases to exist at death. So once again, I am talking with neuroscientist Dr. Chris Thompson to see what he has to say about that. So, Chris, why should we listen to your opinion?
Well, good question. I am a neuroscientist. It's true. I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Washington in Seattle. Before that, I was actually much more interested in the evolution side of things, which is part of how we got in touch with each other initially when we debated on modern day debates. So I have an undergraduate degree in evolutionary biology and ethology. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. I joined that program at the University of Illinois because I was very interested in evolution, but I kind of fell in love with the animal behavior part, and I became very interested in understanding how does animal behavior evolve, and in order to do that, you kind of have to open up the black box to understand how animal behavior evolves. You got to think about the underlying biological mechanisms that mediate that, and for that, that means you got to, like I said, you got to open up the black box. So you need to understand the brain. So that got me more and more interested in neuroscience. So I'm very, very interested in mechanisms that regulate behavior, which is ultimately going to be rooted in the activity of neural networks. So that's what brought me here. Now this question. All right. You want to get into the question?
Let me paraphrase the question.
Yeah, please
let me paraphrase the question a little bit. What I have often, would you mind on camera? You're beating things around. Stop. What I've often seen from these believers is that they, whereas I cannot assume something is true until there's sufficient reason to imply that it is true. I try to take it, maybe that's true and maybe it isn't, but I'm not convinced until there's enough to convince me that, yeah, it looks like there's a thing here. But believers have completely the opposite perspective, where they're going to believe whatever they want to believe until you can prove that it's not true. And you have to, it has to be so conclusive that there's no way that this can be. And then they're going to still believe anyway. I mean, we've just seen that all the time. But they want it to be conclusive proof that it's not true, or they're going to continue to believe it. So a completely backward way of thinking. This is how I see the question. He wants you to shut the door on a possibility. They imagine that a possibility exists until you show that it's not possible. Right. Whereas I don't think a possibility does exist until you show me that it is possible.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm the same way. Yes.
So on the question about the one peer-reviewed study that shows that we die when we die.
Yeah, that's essentially what I'm asking for. Yes, because, okay, so does consciousness end when you die? We define death as the permanent loss of consciousness. That's a big part of the definition.
Well, how do you know it's permanent? I mean, it might come back.
Well, to this point, we have no observations whatsoever of a rotting brain and falling apart, rejuvenating itself, and becoming reborn. There are claims, of course, of such things. We know about such things that claimed around 2,000 years ago. And I'm not just talking about the one guy, Jesus of Nazareth, but we're also talking about all of the saints that came out of the mausoleums, right? Isn't that part of the claim that when Jesus rose from the dead, there were literally thousands of people walking through the streets of Jerusalem, basically like zombies?
Yeah, they were doing the Thriller.
Yeah, that's right. I would have loved to see that. They're like robes and stuff. Yeah. So okay, but there's no evidence that anything like that ever occurred, right?
Well,
So
but aside from there being no evidence,
yeah.
let's. I have to know that we're talking the right language.
Yes, I agree.
So, on the argument of whether consciousness ceases to exist, how does a neuroscientist define consciousness?
Exactly. That is actually what the crux of this is. Consciousness has lots of different definitions depending upon the person using the term. And I know what this guy is using it as, and I assume that essentially he's basically using the definition of consciousness that I refer to as the ghost of the gaps argument. I think we talked about this last time. There's the idea of God of
Not
the
the
gaps.
ghost of the machine.
No, not Ghost of the Machine, Ghost of the Gaps. So of course, you're familiar with, and I'm sure most of your audience is familiar with the God of the Gaps argument that God, at one point was responsible for most of what we know that we see in nature and out in the world. But as we learn how things work naturally, we come up with natural explanations for these things. Well, then we start defining God into a smaller and smaller box. The ghost in the machine has suffered from the same thing. And so I refer to this as the ghost of the gaps issue. We have some people will define consciousness as those things that humans do that we don't have good explanations for. And the thing is, that has only gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. If you look at David Chalmers, who is one of the more famous advocates of the that consciousness can't be explained by a natural phenomena, or at least the known natural phenomena that we have. He's a philosopher at, I believe, Oxford, maybe Cambridge. I'm not too sure. He's this really cool dude who wears a leather jacket and is a philosopher talking about consciousness. But I've read through his book.
Used to have really nice hair.
Yes, that's true. Yes, he did have glorious hair. That's right, like kind of rock star hair. That exactly what I'm talking about. And he's famous for his zombie argument of consciousness. And he also is the person who coined the term the hard problem of consciousness.
Which to help people out with this, because I'm sure that
Yes.
there's going to be somebody that wants to talk about it. And I'm sure that we've mentioned this before because we're discussing kind of the same thing. Chalmers' most famous argument was the hard problem, which so many people thought was unresolved. It was based on what I consider to be a fallacy, wherein he says that you have zero consciousness while you build up all of it. Biological organisms have zero consciousness until they develop neurons, or not just one, but however many neurons. So how many millions of neurons do you need, or trillions of neurons do you need to get before you get to blink, the switch flips, and now you're at 100% consciousness, which is wrong, because it's a false dichotomy. And the way that I see it is it's gradual steps, so that we've seen that the most primitive of unicellular organisms shows a very slight degree of an awareness of itself and its surroundings, enough that it knows when it's in trouble and has to go into fight or flight mode or something like that. In other cases, like a slime mold has navigated a maze and exhibited memory,
has no neurons whatsoever. Yeah.
No, it's one cell. The whole thing is just one cell.
Exactly. So one giant cell. Yes.
So we see it now that consciousness is a dial. And, we like to imagine that we're turned up to 11, but, our political situation has shown otherwise.
True. Yeah, I would agree with that. Once you get into animals where you do have neurons, we see definitely different degrees of consciousness, right? I would certainly argue that there's something special about human consciousness, not special, magical special, just that it's particularly sophisticated, that it's advanced in many ways. But I would also say the same is essentially true for just about all the primates and a lot of other animals. And there are degrees of consciousness that you can find through all animals, for sure, for the same reasons that you're talking about, that they have awareness, perception, that they emote, they have affect, they have drive and motivation. These are the kinds of things. So I talked about Chalmers because in his book, he struggles a little bit with defining consciousness because it's a hard thing to define in some ways, but he lists a whole bunch of behaviors and features of behaviors that in his book that was written in 1996. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it was some time ago when I looked at it. But he has that list of behaviors, and it includes many of the things that I just said. And you could argue back then in the 90s that we didn't have great explanations for human awareness and perception. We knew some of the neural correlates of those things. But at this point, we have a very good understanding of the neural mechanisms that regulate motivation, drive, awareness, perception. There are other aspects that are harder for us to fully pull out, such as executive decision making. We know some of those brain areas that are involved with it, but do we have it fully worked out? No. That's part of the reason why there's still jobs for people like me to work on some of these issues, right? Like if we knew how the brain works entirely, uh, there wouldn't be neuroscientists doing work. So there's still lots and lots of questions to answer, but we're finding more and more of the neural correlates of these features that we call consciousness, and that gap is just getting smaller and smaller. So your inquisitor is basically defining consciousness as something that is something special and magical, that is above or something outside of the physicality of the body that is the brain. And consciousness is a result of the activity of neural networks. That is what it is. And so when you have the cessation of the activity of neural networks to the point where it starts to decompose and fall apart, you are not going to recover consciousness. We know that this is the case. So you can talk about like the medical definition of consciousness, right? So we talk about altered states of consciousness. I've been in an altered state of consciousness once or twice in my day. I assume many of us have. Using drugs and alcohol. So like we know kind of what consciousness is, and we know it can change. There are times when I am unconscious. When I'm asleep, I am not conscious. We have a definition of features that we know, which is what we call consciousness, to the point where, say, someone is in a coma. Now, a person in a coma has a radically changed state of their neural activity, and sometimes we know that they have such severe brain damage that we can refer to them as being essentially brain dead, in a vegetative state is kind of an older term.
I remember hearing an older term. I remember hearing an older term that described exactly that thing.
Mhm.
It was, yes, operating system not found.
Yeah, operating system not found. Exactly. And we also know that the things that we define as consciousness, some of those things, such as personality and executive function, decision making, logic, those things can be changed by changing the brain, either temporarily using transcranial magnetic stimulation. You can put a magnet on people's heads where you stimulate parts of the brain, and you will change the way they behave and the things that they perceive. You can also, I mean, that's like essentially altering consciousness in many ways, but just brain damage. You damage certain areas of the brain that we know will result in changes in that person's personality. Brain damage can be so severe that they no longer express the clinical definition of things that we call consciousness. We would say that that person is unconscious, they're in a coma, or they're in some sort of vegetative state, and that they're essentially brain dead. And you can put them into a scanner and see that the brain is decomposed or that it's so severely damaged that person isn't going to recover. We know that brains don't recover to large degrees past a certain age. It's surprising how much, say, a child who suffers brain damage can recover, but for old codgers like you and me, we got what we got. We're not going to be growing new neurons. In fact, almost all of the neurons in our brain are born by the time we're only 18 months old. Almost every single neuron in the brain is born by that age. And after that, it's just downhill for the most part. There's only one brain area that continues to add new neurons into adulthood. That's called the hippocampus. And it's just the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. It's important for forming long-term memories, which is probably one of the reasons why in mammals it continues to add new neurons, because being able to form new memories throughout adulthood is kind of important because we still need to learn and change. But things like adapting to new languages sure would be nice, but there's sort of a critical period when that gets established, and it's generally by age 8, where if you learn a new language as an adult, you're mostly depending upon logical and memory areas and not the language centers. And that's why you can't learn a new language as an adult. You can't form the phonemes the way a native speaker can. If you learn a second language as a child, you can speak it almost as like a native speaker, right? Because we know the neural circuits that are involved with this, and it's not something that you can just will into existence. There's just behavior is complex, the brain is complex, but there are neural correlates of behavior and there are neural correlates of consciousness. And if you break those areas, you break consciousness. It's a fact.
So on the request
Yeah.
that we produce a conclusive peer-reviewed paper
Right.
that says that when we die, we die.
Right.
I mean, on the surface of that, if we died, if they're able to declare that we died, I'm thinking we died, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
So
Yes.
the question,
There's a list of there's several different lists. Different clinics and different hospitals will use slightly different versions of it, but there's a scale of consciousness that one can read through.
hold on a second.
Sure. Yeah. Uh-oh.
Oh, no, go ahead.
What do we got? So, yes. So there's looking at it, essentially altered levels of consciousness. First of all, the things that we look for are like the degree to one is aware and that they have reason. So we look for aspects of confusion. We look for delirium. We can look for lethargy and somnolence, which is like essentially like sleepiness. But that could also be a sign.
Give me that word again. I've never heard that word.
Somnolence. To be like somnolent is sleepiness. And it's essentially a version of lethargy. Lethargy is to be slow and sluggish, right? And somnolence is sleepiness. And then there's obtundation, which is related to alertness, which an obtundation is like is reduced alertness.
Well, am I going to need the spelling? Is this going to be on the test?
Maybe you're going to have to spell it correctly. Obtundation. And that these are words that I also only learned doing this. Like even though I'm a neuroscientist, I work mostly on how brains are built. I work on like the development of brains and how they get assembled. So my interest in consciousness is strictly just more of a hobby for me. So yeah, and in fact, some of what I am talking about comes from. So I don't want to cite a paper because we talked just briefly about this, but basically citing a paper for when you die, you die. You're not going to find a paper that shows that like consciousness ends when life functions cease to exist. I can cite papers where they describe these levels of like degrees of consciousness from a medical perspective. They're pretty well described, but to say like consciousness ceases when you die, it's just so intuitively obvious. It's kind of like if you wanted me to cite a paper that shows that peanut butter sticks to the roof of your mouth when you put a whole bunch of peanut butter in your mouth. Like it's something that's just so obvious that you don't need a scientific study to show that. We define life, that someone is alive, through the behaviors that they express. That is one of the ways that we define it. When a person dies, they are no longer expressing those behaviors. Therefore, there is no signs of consciousness. They lack consciousness. Then, of course, we have to look for other features. Do they have a pulse? Is there a heartbeat? Can we scan the brain? Yeah. And of course, they're dead.
This is going to conflict somewhat with your assumed definition that this other person is asking me this challenge, maybe assuming, and it's a fair assumption, because I mean I talk to believers every day, and they are all convinced that consciousness is immaterial, that somehow there's a supernatural aspect of it. But of course, you don't see consciousness as immaterial; you see it as completely chemical, right?
Yes, utterly rooted in biology and chemistry. Yes.
So there is an electrochemical aspect to consciousness, right? I mean, you can't be even asleep and not show brainwave activity, right?
No, that's not entirely true. You will. So even though you are unconscious when you are asleep, of course there's still brainwave activity. And that's one of the reasons why we know people are asleep. But the changes that we see in brainwave activity is directly correlated with the degree of consciousness. So if a person is awake, they're going to have brainwave activity that is relatively fast. And in brain areas that are being used, that's when it's going to be particularly fast. So when I say fast, basically we're going to see kind of coordinated activity of neurons firing. They fire and then they stop, and they fire and they stop. The rate that you'll see that coordinated activity, that brainwave activity, will be around 20 to 30 hertz. So 20 to 30 cycles of activity per second. It would be an indication that a brain area is active and being used. If someone is just awake in an aware and awake state, then you would expect overall brainwave activity basically across the entire brain to be around 15 hertz or 15 times per second. So you'll see activity
Okay.
going 15. But when you are in deep sleep, it gets down to somewhere between 1 and 4 hertz. So only basically a single activity or maybe 4 waves of activity per second. So there still
Really
are
that
brain
low?
waves. Yes, that low. Yeah, so it's a
But I'm a
substantial
little
change.
confused at
Yeah.
that because I mean,
Mhm.
aren't isn't that when you're in your deepest sleep? Aren't you dreaming?
No, probably not. In fact, when you're in your deepest sleep, that's probably not when you're dreaming. So when we are falling, so it's called a hypnogram, which is really neat. So that's how we can trace the cycles that people fall into sleep when they go into deep sleep or stage 3 sleep.
I seem to have lost you.
I'm back. Hello.
Okay, good.
There we are. Okay, let me start again. So we have something called the hypnogram, which is the way that we can trace the cycles that people are falling, their sleep cycles, basically. So that when you first fall asleep, your rate of activity, the waves, the brain waves, basically get slower and slower until you get into that 1 to 4 hertz range, and that happens pretty quickly. So as soon as you start to fall asleep, within about 30 to 45 minutes, you are in deep, deep sleep. And that stretch will last about 2 to 3 and sometimes maybe even 4 hours long. And then you start to go up, and that's when you start to get REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. But the brain waves to actually go up, and they can get pretty close to what is considered. There we are. I don't
Chris?
know what's going on. Yes.
Yeah, I got they can get, you get into REM sleep and then
I
your
got into
brainwaves will
REM
come
sleep.
up and they get
So
pretty close to.
yes. They get pretty close to being close to, when you are awake and aware, but you're
Okay.
still asleep. That's REM sleep, and we think that's when dreaming is happening, is likely during those more active areas, that those periods of time, and that's like the second half of sleep tends to be those 4 hours or so, like, before you actually wake up, if you're talking about an 8-hour cycle. So the first 3 to 4 hours is really, really deep sleep. We don't think that there's a whole lot of dreaming happening then, but dreaming probably happens more in these wakeful periods where you kind of go up and then down and up and down, and it's like every 45 minutes or so when you're going through these cycles. And so sometimes when you wake up and you think that you have been dreaming, or you remember your dream, you probably woke up during like an REM phase, but sometimes you wake up and you're just like, oh wow, I don't even remember, and you might feel really groggy for a little bit. That's because you were probably in one of those down cycles, and you probably weren't dreaming during that time. So the dreaming is, also related to the activity that's happening in our brains. Of
Okay,
course
so
it is.
but the question was that even when you're asleep, you're still
Yes.
showing brain
You
activity,
you
and
still, of
and you're
course, have
saying,
brain activity, but it's so low that obviously you're not, expressing the behaviors that we normally associate with normal awake type behaviors. So we refer to that as being unconscious, like you are
okay,
unconscious when you're asleep.
well, let me put this in more, I don't know, mechanical terms.
Yeah.
Something like if you're running all the lights and all of the devices and everything in your house, you go outside and you look at your electric meter, it's yeah, it's going to be running pretty high. But then in the middle of the night, you go out there with a flashlight, take a look at it
Yep.
again, and it's running really low.
Yep.
But then, of course, if you forgot to pay your power bill and it's off,
Mhm.
it's going to look
That
slightly
that's
different.
yeah, that then it's very different. Yes, or like, a hurricane comes blowing through and knocks down the power lines, right? You can try to turn on all the devices, it doesn't matter. A body, okay, our bodies are set up, we evolved to maintain organization, right? We have to seek food to maintain a body that can remain organized, right? Not decompose and fall apart. And all these molecular processes that we have within our cells is dependent upon the fact that I need to eat, 2 or 3 times a day and also get rid of waste. Like and of course there have to be neural circuits that drive those behaviors. Those neural circuits can become more and more sophisticated over millions of years of evolution, to the point where we work in social circles, that now we need to have communication. So now I need to have some sort of like language in order to talk to my partner, so that we can be more efficient with gathering these resources, and so that I can, also spend time finding a mate and doing other things too, right? So you can imagine that evolution could easily evolve once you have animals that need to find things and gather resources. And all animals do, right? They have to gather resources to some degree. Even like, sessile animals in the bottom of the ocean, even though they're just sitting there, they still are filter feeding and grabbing resources. There will be some motivation, some circuit in our bodies that will tell us that we need to go do this. And animals that are going to be more sophisticated, like the vertebrates with relatively complex nervous systems, well, you're going to see all kinds of interesting neural circuits that will drive different kinds of behaviors. And those layers of behaviors is essentially how we kind of think about consciousness, especially within the neuroscience community. It's the people who believe in woo and the more overt religious parts of this definition, where they want to define consciousness as something that is special and above or removed from the actual biological and chemical material that we know is the thing that actually is responsible for creating these behaviors.
I like listening to the woo merchants when they start talking about, like psychic energies. I like the way you pluralize energies in a way that,
you don't
physical scientists,
yeah.
Scientists don't pluralize energies that way. Just believers do that.
That's right. We talk about forces, but there's like the 4 fundamental forces, and it has to be one of the 4, and you can say which one it is, right? No, the energy.
But when they do this kind of thing, when they talk about the psychic energies and everything, I have to raise my hand and say, is this measured in newtons, ohms, calories, horsepower, watts?
Right. How do you define energy? Right. Are you using the physical definition of energy? No, of course they're not. Yeah, they're defining it as something that is special and above, the things that we can define through science. But all right, you have, if you're going to claim that like there's, I don't know. All right, so if you're going to claim that there is some extra thing that is responsible for consciousness in human beings, or say even in animals, you need to have some way of defining what that is so that I can understand what you mean. And you cannot use word salad or just borrow terms like energies without fully defining it. And that's the problem that I always have when I'm talking to people. I totally agree with you. They'll use the term something like energies, or getting into auras or these kinds of things. And like, well, what do you even mean by that when you're doing that? Nope. We have a guest.
And it looks like we do have a guest here. Cafe, I'm guessing you're the one that posed to the question of how do we know that we die when we die?
Well, I mean, that was a question you asked in the show. I thought the implication was, how do you know that consciousness ceases when at the moment of death? Was the question. Okay,
well then, Chris, let me paraphrase the question. And first of all, so that we don't have to make assumptions, he's got a neuroscientist's definition of consciousness. What is yours?
I agree with the neuroscientific definition. Only I guess the underpinnings that I know there's a lot of evidence within I guess the collection of neuroscientists, the common agreement that materialist assumption that the brain is responsible for generating consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I that's what I would probably fundamentally disagree with in order to say such a question, like, does consciousness truly blink out when we die? And I think that's maybe where the contention leads. But nevertheless, everything else when it comes to neurocorrelates and things like that, I'm pretty on board with most of it.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, we can alter brain states and see alterations in consciousness, right? We can of course do it experimentally, but it happens naturally every single day. When you fall asleep, you are unconscious, and that is directly correlated to changes in brain areas is responsible for the things that we usually associate with consciousness, such as executive thinking, logic, awareness, perception. These things are well rooted in neural circuits. And then, of course, if you go in and alter them, or say like permanently alter them by damaging them, there are going to be permanent changes to the details of what we would consider to be conscious activity to that individual. Like,
Well,
so already like that's the experiment essentially. And so if you kill someone, or if like someone dies, right? Well, we're not going to kill anyone. So if someone dies by natural causes, we obviously have a medical definition of consciousness. It's going to be a series of things related to behavior, their reasonable processing, whether they're delusional or not. Are they sleepy, lethargic, those kinds of things? There's a list. Like, medical professionals use this list, and we use that as a gauge to say, well, what degree of consciousness does this person have? Anyone that comes in with some sort of altered behavior where we're concerned about them, you can go through that list and see, well, what degree of consciousness do they have? And of course, down at the bottom is if they still have a heartbeat and a pulse, but they're expressing no features of consciousness, we would say that they're in a coma, or that perhaps they have experienced brain death, right?
No, I absolutely agree with that. I guess the argument where I come from is, so, you have the example of Phineas Gage. I'm sure you're familiar.
Sure. Yeah.
Comes up a lot.
Yeah. I mean, just for the audience. So Phineas Gage, one of the most famous neurological cases in neuroscience. We learn about it first year in graduate school. He was a worker on a rail line, I believe, and they were using dynamite to clear out a space. And part of getting the dynamite down into these holes so they can break away the rock, they have to use a tamping rod, push the dynamite down. And as they did it, there must have been some sort of spark or something, and the rod shot out and went through his head. And yes, it's a pretty good example, because what happened for him before the accident, he was considered to be a very affable, very kind person, had a certain kind of personality. After the accident, his personality was radically changed, and it had struck areas of his prefrontal and frontal cortex. It blasted apart, I believe, the orbital prefrontal cortex, which we know is associated with. What was that?
I mean, be fair. Yeah. People do change their behavior when they have a headache.
That's sure true, which is also rooted in physicality. And I, kind of like the funny thing about Phineas Gage, and I think one of the arguments one could make is that, well, if you had a rod slammed through your head, don't you think you would also be a little upset? But mostly he was okay, right? Like, he didn't suffer too much physically. Like, he wasn't utterly physically deformed, even though he had this rod go through his head. But it went up through here and then out the top. He did lose a bunch of brain matter, and there were changes to his personality after that. Now, there's been a lot of debate to the degree to which, like, all of that was thoroughly documented. But we have lots of other just clinical examples of people who have suffered various aspects of brain damage where, they clearly have some changes in their overall personality, or changes in aspects of consciousness, right? To the point where, like, they aren't really expressing full consciousness. Now, I don't have a paper for you, all right? You wanted citation that when you die, the consciousness ceases. I did a little looking. I didn't spend that much time, but I did a little looking. I wasn't going to be able to find something like that. But a great book that I think is fantastic on just understanding consciousness and understanding that it is rooted in physicality and isn't dependent upon magic, is The Hidden Spring by Mark Solms. He is a neurologist and a neuropsychologist. He's from South Africa. This book is just fantastic. It's called The Hidden Spring. I fully, I mean, he's a neuroscientist, so of course, like, it's kind of written in my language, but I feel like it's written in a way that anyone who is interested in the topic could really understand it. And he's from personal experience and work that he has done, he really expanded my understanding of like the way the human brain works, which is not something I work on. I don't work on human brains. I know a fair amount about human brains because, of course, you have to, because that's the context that we put this all in. I learned an awful lot about human consciousness and the neural correlates of human consciousness from him. And I like his definition of consciousness, that it actually, so there are individuals who are completely decerebrate, meaning they don't have a cerebral cortex. People could be born without a cerebral cortex. And you would think like, well, without a cerebral cortex, how can you even exist? But it turns out, yes, those people suffer enormously behaviorally. They cannot do the things that we're doing right now, like talking to each other and able to form like full sentences or whatever. But they do express some aspects on that list of consciousness, but they don't even have a cortex. That indicates that it isn't just the cortex that is critical for conscious features. And he makes a very good argument that things like the periaqueductal gray and the Raphe nuclei of the brainstem are critical aspects of consciousness. And these are things that you're going to find in all vertebrates to some degree. And these are the things that are really important for controlling mood and affect, how we are feeling and the emotions that we're expressing. And of course, those are the things that are also affected when we take, say, mind-altering substances that alters our state of consciousness. It's all rooted in chemistry, and it's not, you damage those areas. And he makes a very good case that damage to those areas leads to a substantial drop in the aspects that we call consciousness.
But have you considered that when someone dies, perhaps they just go deaf and they can no longer hear you calling their name or asking them questions?
Of course, I've considered that. But okay, here's what influenced my thinking on all of that. Like you mentioned, substances. I don't know if you have any familiarity with direct experience with things like psychedelics.
Unfortunately, I don't. I mean, I actually am interested, but
and that's what really flipped the way I see these things, because I hold that view of where the neuroscientists have this consensus that this correlation between brain damage and the effect on personality and so forth that you just mentioned about Phineas Gage. Yep. And so where it flipped, I would like to kind of hash it out real quick to give you a quick analogy. I'm borrowing this from Graham Hancock. This is not original, but he did say to the flip side. So the standard model of, the materialist assumption is that consciousness is produced by the brain. And so that you have, like, let's say you have a factory that produces cars. So if you destroy the factory, the cars being produced is the stream of consciousness. And if you destroy the factory, then you destroy consciousness being produced, ergo consciousness leaks out. That's the consensus model that a lot of neuroscientists would agree with. Mm-hmm. Sure. And so the other model is more akin to a radio transceiver. So like the radio. So like if you have a radio set and you have a signal that's being transceived, then if you destroy the radio, it may affect the way the signal is interpreted. So, if you have these two views, of the effects being made on the personality look exactly identical from these two perspectives.
Right.
So like
I get what you're saying, and I can appreciate the analogy. Now you can take the analogy further to say, well, why don't we look for whether we have a factory or whether we have a radio receiver? Yes. And that's what the problem. So we see behaviors, right? We know that there are behaviors that we associate with consciousness. We can look in the brain. Do these brain areas, are they set up to generate and create the things like the stream of cars that we would refer to as consciousness? Or are they set up to receive some sort of signal from someplace in order to manifest the signal, right? That's essentially the idea. When we look at the brain, it is entirely set up to generate behavior de novo. It is a factory, absolutely 100%. So we have brain areas that are responsible for taking in sensory information. We have areas that are critical for awareness and perception. We know those in extraordinary detail. And I'm not referring to that as like a receiver receiving some sort of consciousness signal. That's just being aware of the environment. Then that information gets processed and we know the areas that are involved in the processing and the selection of attention to focus on only certain features that are within the environment. Because if we focused on every single thing happening in the environment, it would be impossible for us to actually direct our energies towards things that are actually
to function. It would be impossible for the ego to function.
Right. And then decision making is, like certain things, like areas like MT, for instance. There's this area of the visual stream that's way up the visual stream. It is attentional in that it will become active when they're like dots moving across the screen, for instance. And say some of them are moving and some of them are moving in other directions, but a person or even a primate would need to make a decision about like, okay, I think the majority of dots are going to the right or to the left. And we know that activity in this area, MT, goes up right before the person makes a decision on like, oh, the dots are going to the right or they're going to the left. And so that is clearly, and I'm by right before, I mean like literally hundreds of milliseconds before. So, and it's receiving all this input from these visual areas. Like and of course the visual areas, the farther lower you get into like V1, the primary visual cortex or secondary visual cortex, I'm talking about like the very early stages of visual information coming from the eye. They're only reading out very, very simple aspects of our visual field. And then as you go up further and further, you get more and more complexity that gets built from the neural circuits and the way that that's done. And we know how many of those neural circuits are built.
Okay. I would ask this. Are you a fan at all of Sam Harris?
I think Sam Harris is fine. There are certain things that I think that he says and does that are problematic. I don't agree with him on everything, but I think that there are.
Well, that's the reason I asked.
Yes.
Because I
Yes.
wanted to see that discomfort in you.
Yeah.
Because like he is like I guess an atheist that's kind of at the edge of spirituality.
Yes, I agree.
And it kind of rubs a lot of atheists wrong that don't agree with spirituality. And so, the area that I like to focus in, and I've called, I've never had really the opportunity to speak to Aaron until this more recent episode. The last time I called in, the phone lines went down, so I didn't get to have an opportunity to speak to him. That
was so frustrating.
Yeah, I appreciate his input a lot more. He's a little bit more. For me, I don't know if you still hang around with Matt nowadays, Aaron, but he's become so kind of rigid in his the way he takes calls and like.
Auntie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it's kind of hard to have a conversation with him. Whereas with Aaron, like he'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Whereas Matt will cut you off because he wants to get directly to if you don't answer his question the right or wrong way, then
true. Yeah. Yeah.
And so
it's just I'm going to go out on a limb and say that with Matt, he's got another decade on me about taking live calls.
Yes. And I think that's what it comes down to. It. I agree.
Yeah.
It's frustrated quickly because he's like, I've heard this 20 times and I just don't have the patience for this.
Yeah. Maybe he's lost his patience over the years, perhaps.
I think so.
However, the one call that I've been trying, desperately for him to hear is a call on mystical experience. I'm not too sure how deeply you study mystical experience within the context of neuroscience. And I'm talking about Dr. Roland Griffith's work with, especially with the psilocybin-induced mystical experience.
Okay.
And so
I'm not very familiar with all that work. I mean, I work on brain development. So I'm working on things that are very early before we really are concerned.
But as a neuroscientist, does it intrigue you at all? Do you, at least?
Sure. Yeah. I find the issue of consciousness to be utterly fascinating. I mean, I've even worked on constructing a class that I can teach here at Virginia Tech on consciousness, on the neural correlates of consciousness.
Yes.
So, and we, I have not set up that class yet, so I don't have all of that worked out. But aspects of psilocybin and the mystical experience and altered states of consciousness would absolutely be a part of that class.
I wonder how, if you set this class up, if you actually start teaching consciousness, what are you going to do with students that fall asleep?
Man,
you're gonna have to change your consciousness right now because you are in an unconscious state. Yeah. You're supposed to be conscious in the consciousness class.
Bill Hicks joked like that too. He said he was taking this course in Eastern philosophy, and the professor said, uh, you know, consciousness. God is consciousness, and we are all individuals. We're all consciousness trying to realize our fullest potential. And he phrased it like that, and then he said, when the guy in the back said, "Yeah, is that going to be on the test? Are we going to need to know this?" Try to make trivialize it, and. But I think where I'm getting at is like writers like or even like psychiatrists and psychologists like Stanislav Grof. Have you heard of him?
Mm-hmm. That name rings a bell. I'm not too sure what they do though.
He said, within almost decades into his studies and his professional, role that he played, he didn't realize that there is absolutely no concrete, definitive evidence that consciousness is generated by the brain. We have a lot of things that seem to hint towards this, very strongly so, but he said a lot of neuroscientists, psychiatrists, psychologists do not realize that at the very core of all these peer-reviewed studies, there's no definitive evidence that this is the case.
This is the thing. I feel like it's going back, unfortunately, to the thing that I kind of started off with, is that people who operate with that sort of mindset, and there are neuroscientists that feel that way. You cited one, and there are others. And definitely within the philosophical circles around consciousness, you find this a lot. They are redefining consciousness to be smaller and smaller to exclude the things that we have now fully explained, or at least we have adequate explanation from a neuroscientist perspective. I would certainly concede there are aspects of human behavior that we have not fully worked out. There's a reason, right? The brain is really, really complex. We have not gotten there yet. We are still working on it. There's no indication that those types of behaviors are rooted in something that is not physical, though.
Well, I don't think that's the argument, though. I
Sure,
think that's
okay.
I don't think necessarily like Roland Griffiths is trying to say that mystical experiences are something that defy the laws of nature. He's done many lectures over this.
And David Chalmers would say that too, right? He's the philosopher, right? He argues that there must be some other force of nature that we don't really
understand. Yeah.
And I don't believe that. I don't think.
Well, Sean Carroll argues the opposite. I happened to be in the room when he gave a presentation in San Diego, where he did this beautiful equation, which I put on my unapologetic science videos. There's this massive equation that shows up in the opening splash of all those. That's from Sean Carroll, and he was saying that that people would often say that we don't know that there is no supernatural, that there is no afterlife or whatever, and then he just points to the equation. He goes, "Yeah, we know." This is one of the ways to know that there's no way. One of the things that Chris and I had talked about on a previous conversation is how the mind cannot be separated from the body. That the mind, for a number of different reasons, cannot be put into a different body. What would happen if you could put the mind, hypothetically, if you could put the mind into the different body, it wouldn't be you anymore, because the construct of your mind in terms of physical neurons and everything, whatever muscle memory, whatever foreign languages and musical aptitudes or whatever that previous mind had, if you put your mind into that brain, you would have those aptitudes. You would, in effect, not be you anymore. You wouldn't be that other person either, maybe, but you wouldn't be.
You can't occupy the same space and time.
Right. David Chalmers' argument, the zombie argument, right, that you can't have a philosophical zombie, is exactly that. But although, except that he says that if you could reconstruct, say, you or a body and all the different parts, everything, and just make it poof into existence next to you, that entity would be empty. It would be dark inside, even though it may continue to act in a way that seems as if it's conscious. He thinks that there's something that is separate from that entity. And that just seems utterly absurd to me. First of all, it's just a philosophical argument. We can't really literally just manifest the exact copy next to us. But I totally think that that's absurd. Now, I agree with Arn, though, that if you could do something like that, that entity would share an awful lot with you, initially especially, but eventually, pretty quickly, everything's going to diverge. So, like, if I could just duplicate myself instantaneously at this moment, the entity next to me would continue to say the words that I am saying, right? Because there is a series of language centers that we know pretty well that is driving the sentences that are coming out of my mouth, that are acting on the muscles that control my respiration and my vocal cords, allow me to create these annotations. But then all of a sudden, that entity next to me would be talking, and then I would hear that, and then all of a sudden I would stop and I would look, and then the entity would look at me, and now all the activity is starting to diverge, and now we got to have a conversation. We're going to take turns, and obviously the things that I'm doing are going to be different than whatever the entity is doing that's next to me.
Well,
but it would be the same thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant by that. You can't occupy the same space and time. Yes. That, let's say you had our universe somehow in the same way that an egg splits into twins, in the womb. Yep. A universe does this. Does that mean if you have an atomical copy in that other universe that it's you? No, because it's
obviously not. Yes, we have twins all the time, and they're very different. Yes, like we know that. And actually, that
before we get too philosophical, I want to get back to your initial question, which was based on this other philosopher's claim, apparently, when he says that there is no evidence. And I would probably have to look up where you wrote what you wrote about that. You said
Stanislav's graph. I can link you, man.
There is no evidence that consciousness stops when the brain dies. So I don't know what definition of evidence he's using, but the only ones that I know of, facts that are concordant with a particular position, or the fact that indicates, I think is the simplest one. The fact that when you die, you stop answering questions.
Well, if you want to play a quick clip, I posted it in the private chat. Aaron, if you don't mind me asking, where are you broadcasting this live to? I've been trying to look for the page.
Oh, I'm not. I'm
okay, awesome. All right, this is cool. All right, this is awesome. All right, I know I like,
because sometimes I don't know if I'm going to need to edit something. As I was afraid I was going to have to edit this because it was
this is perfect, man. I really enjoy this. I'm glad to be speaking to both of you guys. If you don't mind, I didn't catch your name.
I'm Chris. Yes,
Chris. All right.
Yes. Chris Thompson,
my real name is Jimmy, but I go by Cafe in a lot of the forums. But I don't mind Jimmy, man. And I know Aaron. So I got confused in the last episode because they had two Aarons, Aaron and Aaron, and so it became a little confusing.
I was enjoying that. It was one of the few times that I didn't have to constantly correct everybody's pronunciation.
Yeah, so I'm looking at Stanislav's graph, a little bit about him. He's apparently 93 and still alive.
He was. I mean, he focused on a lot of transpersonal psychology, and
right. And he's done a lot on psychedelics, but he's also talked a bit about near-death experiences too.
Yeah, and when it comes to the neuroscientists, I would probably emphasize Dr. Roland Griffiths. He unfortunately died last year in October.
How do you know?
It was, they call this explosion in neuroscience with psychedelics the psychedelic renaissance. I don't know if you've heard that term. It was in the New York Times, the most recent article. But psychedelic renaissance. If you search that term, it's a colloquial, kind of like the social gadflies term for the explosion in science that's occurring right now with psychedelics. And there's psychedelic research happening all over the world between, I think there's 2 universities in New Mexico, some in California. There's one that just happened in Texas, and University of Austin. UK is doing a DMT study where they put DMT IV drip. So they intravenously administer DMT as long as you can stand it. So they can keep you there indefinitely. Pretty interesting study that's going on in the UK right now. And the reason I focus on a lot of this stuff in relative to neuroscience to go into, I guess, where this conversation is leading. is that a lot of neuroscientists, when they describe this so-called mystical experience, I'm not sure if you've looked too deeply into how they define that within the context of the research, but they go by 6 criteria. And the 6 criteria were originally laid down by William James in the early 1900s in his book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, or Varieties of Religious Experience. And they've refined that over decades of research, to the point where they got it now with the Johns Hopkins studies. And that's been the kind of the crux that laid the basis for all these, the rest of the studies to happen. And so they, maybe you've heard the term ego death.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Yeah. And so the neuroscientific, I guess, equivalent of phrasing that would be a diminishing in activity in the default mode network.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And so, so there is this complete dissolution of your ordinary sense of self. Mm-hmm. And, so usually when people identify egoically with their consciousness, they identify with their body, and inside these experiences, Eastern philosophy might refer to it as non-dualism, that the subject-object dichotomy that you have between you and the rest of reality completely dissolves inside that experience. There is no such distinction that takes place. Mm-hmm. And that's very hard to imagine for people who've not had that phenomenon in consciousness occur.
Sure.
Yes. Like you said, you've never had psychedelics. You've never probably partaked in a, maybe you've never meditated in your life, or
no, that's not true. I have. Okay. I think that there's a fair amount of value for meditation.
Yes. But have you ever had a profound experience with meditation where you can no longer distinguish your body from the rest of reality?
Yes, I've never gotten to that point. And we know that, for instance, say Buddhist monks that get to that point of meditation where they feel as if they are removed from their body.
Yes.
Some of those monks have agreed to go into functional MRI machines.
Yes.
And they can see that the area of the brain that is the manifestation of our sensory self, like it basically the homunculus, the sensory homunculus.
Yeah.
The activity goes way, way down when they are at that state. When they say like,
the
activity in those areas goes away.
The activity in the default network goes down.
Sure.
But not.
So I would imagine that that's true too. But no, we also know that the activity within the sensory homunculus goes down.
Well, let me show you a diagram. Hold on. Let me see. Simon.
Well, I don't have a lot of experience with psychedelics. I have done transcendental meditation, and I can speak to the point when I should have been able to leave my body, when I could feel the vibrations, which is the one aspect about it that I could actually verify were real. When you talk to some transcendental people, that they will tell you about the vibrations, if they're going to be consistent at all, because not all of them are. But when they are, they would talk about these vibrations, and they're kind of unmistakable. That was the one thing that I was given, was that, how do you know when you're feeling these? Oh, you'll know. There won't be any question about it. And in the few times that did happen, and it was multiple times for me, there was no mistake. But I don't know if I'm hitting a plateau of what you're talking about with consciousness.
The non-dualism.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Non-dualism, where you have this
non-dualism,
complete dissolution between the subject-object dichotomy,
right? Where the state of consciousness is, there's no distinction between it and your body. The dualist idea that there's the mind and then the body. Of course, I don't believe in dualism. I don't think the mind is something that's separate.
Well, I mean, a dualistic in the
but you're saying non-dualism, where mind and body, all of that is dissolved anyway, and that consciousness.
No, non-dualistic in the sense that you no longer you cannot identify as a material body.
You don't identify yourself as your body.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, because you can't make a distinction between your material body and the rest of reality.
I wish I could agree with that, but that was one of the frustrations that I had. I was so desperate to try to do this disassociative thing because I wanted to experience the supernatural. I wanted to get outside of my body and experience whatever this paranormal realm is firsthand. Because back then, everybody believed, even atheists, just randomly everybody believed that this sort of thing was possible. They all believed in telekinesis and all of that. And I was a spiritual person as a teenager, and so I wanted to try this. But when I'm trying to now disassociate my astral form from my physical form, I'm keeping my body completely still, and there was and I was not able to rise out of my body. I wasn't able to figure out how to, without moving a muscle, without moving at all, how do I float out or do whatever. And then there was a later experiment that I performed where I was not supposed to be able to do, while these vibrations were going on, I was not supposed to be able to move, but I realized that I can in fact move.
All right. And before I comment real quick, I got this in homage to you, man. I want to ask you real quick, what are you drinking tonight, man?
This is a local brew.
It's not an IPA?
This is Revolver Blood and Honey. This is an American ale made with blood orange and honey.
All right, American ale. Man, dude, you're always drinking something really exotic, dude. Because I knew, like I told you, I try to rush over here out of class. I try to make it here as quick as possible. Awesome. But before I did, I stopped at the store. I got the closest thing I can get to something that would. You would probably, sure. Yeah, you would probably hate this. I know this is like nothing that would be on your roster, but it's a New Belgium IPA, and I
can do Belgian, but I don't do IPA.
You don't like IPAs? I'm not a fan of IPAs either. My favorite is Hefeweizen. I love a good Hefeweizen. My favorite. My favorite one you can no longer get in the States. It was Francis Connor Dunkel. And I went to Australia, and somebody took me into a bottle shop in Australia when they discontinued it in the United States. I couldn't get this beer anymore, so they take me to a bottle shop in Sydney, and as soon as I walked in, I saw it, and I took every bottle they had. I filled a shopping cart with it because I was going to be there for a week. So, yes, Francis Connor Dunkel is very good, and anything from Francis Connor is really good. Like their Hefeweizen is excellent, just a regular one, which I think you can probably find in places in the U.S., but not the Dunkel. But there's a pretty good Dunkel that's a Hefeweizen. It's by Weihenstephaner. So they have a Weihenstephaner Dunkel, which is a really good Dunkel.
Yeah, I think that one. I think I've tried that one, and it didn't compare to Francis Connor.
Yeah.
But if I can channel Tomer for a moment, I think we're getting off topic.
We are getting a little bit off topic.
I wanted to come back to it. I before we go though, I know you pay attention to ABV. What's the ABV on that?
On the one I have here?
Yeah.
Well, this is just an American ale, so it's not going to be a stout, so it's not going to be high.
Because I know you're real fond of what would you say?
7.
7. Okay, not bad. I know you're fond of saying like double-digit ABV. I'm like, all right, he's drinking the strong ass shit, man. Yeah. This is only 9 ABV.
That's pretty close though.
Yeah.
I'm trying to have a serious conversation. I've got
to get back on track. Yeah. So
you can't get into double digits if you're going to discuss
what I wanted to introduce to you guys. So by bringing up the topic of non-dualism, this place, so to speak, where, or if you will, where, these practitioners, because you mentioned the studies that they study under fMRI. Perhaps you've heard of the Carmelite nuns that were studied under fMRI. It's a real famous peer-reviewed study that was done. I forget the year. And then there's also the Tibetan monks that were studied under EEG. But the point here is that this phenomenon that they describe of the complete dissolution of the subject-object dichotomy is one of the defining markers of what they call a complete mystical experience. And by complete, they go by the 6 markers. And I recall one episode of the Atheist Experience where Matt let me list them all 6. And after he hung up on me, of course, what else is new, right? he turned to Phil Session, his co-host that day, and he said, "Well, let's go over the 6 and let's see if you identify with any single one." And they went over the 6 and they couldn't identify with a single one. To me, that's a perfect proof that they've never had this type of phenomenon occur in themselves.
Yeah.
And so what I'm getting at with that is that this the breakdown, this dissolution, this all is one tends towards like if maybe you've read Aldous Huxley and his notion of the mind at large. That we're all kind of tapping into one consciousness, but we experience it subjectively. And I suppose that would be the spiritualist interpretation, because like I said, I absolutely agree with all the neurocorrelates and all the details that a neuroscientist might find in their consensus that the brain is generated by consciousness. But I don't think we fundamentally know that point to assume that is the case. And it's because I've had my own experiences with psychedelics and had a complete mystical experience for myself that now my interpretation has tended towards this. So if you get every volunteer in the study, they will say without fail, invariably, that consciousness in this phenomenon, of course, I don't want to create a misconception here. They don't interview the volunteers while they're having this experience. Like while at the height of the trip,
Right. Talk about it afterwards. Yeah.
They can't even identify their body from the rest of reality. How are you going to have a conversation with them?
Sure.
Right. So they wait till this is over until they return to the baseline of consciousness. And then they try to ask them what they can recall about the experience. And of course, right when they get out of it, the first thing they say is, "There's no way I can possibly put that into words. This is ineffable." But they don't stop there. The professionals involved in these studies follow them along for months. They do 14-month follow-ups, increments where they follow and they continue to not only interview them, but they interview family members, coworkers, and so forth. And eventually, after the volunteer has time to mull it over, they invariably express that consciousness inside that phenomenon seemed to them to be indestructible, something that cannot cease to be. This is invariably expressed by all volunteers who have this experience.
So once again, Chris, how do you measure consciousness? And you hook up these electrodes or whatever, you've got a reading.
I mean, that's a way to measure brain activity. We define, again, it depends on how you define consciousness. That is usually just done through psychological evaluation. Like there's a certain number of features that we look for. There's a list of things that we evaluate, and you test the person, the degree of which they have awareness, perception, their reason, their logic. Like there are various things that we can use to test to see.
But you would agree that people who have passed out from over drinking perform very poorly on these psychological evaluations, right?
And to do very poorly. That's part of the reason why we define that as an altered state of consciousness. Or if they have completely passed out, we would say that they are unconscious because they are not registering on those scales.
But when they're dead, is there a marked difference in the reading that cannot be mistaken for any other living time?
Absolutely, yes. So certain things that we can look for. If someone is unconscious, but they are expressing signs of life, such as breathing, a heartbeat, heart rate, pulse, but they aren't expressing what we typically associate with consciousness, awareness, perception, talking, reasoning, those kinds of things. That person is just unconscious, but not dead. Dead means they no longer have pulse or heart rate and brain activity. And once someone is dead for some length of time, the brain will start to degenerate and there's no way to get it back, right? Like it does.
So in the multiple ways of measuring consciousness, obviously you can't do an evaluation on something that can't communicate or, follow your eyes with a little flashlight or whatever. I mean, it is also possible to lose the brain activity, whatever you would consider to be consciousness, even while the body is alive. You mentioned certain types of brain damage. You mentioned being in a coma, for example.
Yep, that's right. Yes.
Okay.
And
So
it requires a substantial amount of damage to have someone be completely unconscious, or to the point where they have absolutely no conscience whatsoever. If you can get that person awake somehow, if they're in a coma, you can wake up from a coma and then again express consciousness, right? Those people, of course, still have intact brain areas. If they have substantial damage to the brain and somehow you get their eyes open, you will look for things. Can they focus on objects? Can they speak? Can they understand things? If they can't do those things, well, now the degree to which they are conscious goes way, way down. And you would say that they have brain damage, or that they are
so then again,
a persistent vegetative state.
We end up with something where we don't even have a hypothesis on how, what mechanism or possibility could even exist for a consciousness to continue in a dead body.
No,
there's literally not even a possibility for that.
None whatsoever, as far as neuroscience is concerned. Behavior is a manifestation of the activity of neural networks. If neural networks cease to be active, you will not get behavior. Consciousness is utterly dependent upon behavior.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to have to close up because we've been well over our hour. I kept it up a little bit long because I know you wanted to be on here.
Yes.
And I appreciate that. But we can't keep going on. I feel that we're beating a dead horse.
A little. Now, Cafe, I actually would be interested in maybe having a discussion as a follow-up. If you wanted to, I have a YouTube channel. If you just look up Dr. Chris Thompson and check it out, I'd be cool with doing some kind of stream where we talk a little bit further. I won't hang up on you. I don't know what the 6 levels of mysticism are. I'm a little curious. I'll hold off and wait to have that.
I'll share your email address in PMs so that you guys can get connected.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and end this one. Cafe, thank you for being on. Thank you for posing the question.
Yeah, it was actually a pleasure talking to you. I was I feel like there's an awful lot about this topic that that I don't, and I'd like to learn a little bit more.
I appreciate it. I don't hold any official credentials, but I am an autodidact of a ravenous degree. I'm a very ravenous reader. I keep up with a lot of the neuroscience that comes out of this. I subscribe to a lot of stuff where if I get a new peer-reviewed paper on psychedelics pops up, I'm there to read it. So
great. It's great.
I was an autodidact in practically everything for a long time, so respect for that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it up.
Good deal.
Good night.
Adios.